Always a thrill to return to Silverstone. Lots of heritage here. I guess that's the main reason. 1950, first round of the World Championship, staged at Silverstone. If you might have seen a documentary we produced recently with Sky on exactly that race, won by Giuseppe Farina, of course, but much more importantly, it was a race attended by the King and Queen of England and a crowd of around 150,000 people. Well, that was 1950, and delighted to know now that we have another 5 years of the British Grand Prix at Silverstone. I don't ever really think that was in doubt. I think the cost of putting on a street race in London, which was the other leverage point, was so vast that it was never really a starter. So yeah, predictable that it's continued, but good news certainly. Love to talk about a couple of key races from my perspective at Silverstone. There are so many, but one of them particularly always stands out, and that's the 1965 British Grand Prix, won of course by Jim Clark in the green and yellow Lotus 33 Climax, one of the greatest Grand Prix cars of all time, I think, in terms of looks and performance, in that golden year of Jimmy when he won the Indy 500 and the World Championship in the same year. But that British Grand Prix win was undoubtedly one of his best ever drives, for the simple reason that he had quite a comfortable lead going into the closing phase of the race, ahead of Graham Hill's BRM, which was actually in some sort of, I think he's had running out of brakes actually. So Jimmy had the race in the bag, but then his engine went off song. They could hear it as he went past the pits. The pits, of course, over on the far end of the circuit, or this end of the circuit now, as I stand here, just on the outside of the perimeter of Silverstone. Colin Chapman could hear the engine note going off, but in the cockpit, of course, Jimmy had to make his own mind up about what was happening. And he realized that, of course, he could see from the gauge that he was losing oil pressure, maybe he had an oil leak. And so going into the last few laps of the race, he decided to nurse the engine home by declutching going into Stowe and Club, letting the revs drop to zero, so there was no load on the engine when there was no oil because of the lateral load. And of course he won the race in that way. So what a drive. Here's a picture. I actually saw this in the BRDC office the other day. This is Jimmy in the course of that win, and I like to think it was one of those moments when he was declutching, the back end had come round, and just phenomenal car control to balance the car in that situation. So that's why I'm all dressed up in this Jim Clark regalia, green and yellow for the day. That's partly because, you know, Jim Clark for me is still probably the greatest driver of all time, but then we all have our own drivers from our own eras. And particularly now that we have this great merchandise produced by the Jim Clark Trust because of the new museum, Jim Clark Museum, that's going to be opened officially by Sir Jackie Stewart at the end of August. And don't forget that if you go to jimclarktrust.com, you can have your chance to win a Jim Clark edition of a Lotus Evora, and that's the one signed by all the drivers who competed in the 2019 Monaco Grand Prix. Also, a little detail I've got here, you may have noticed that at the beginning of the video we got the Omologato Watches logo. That's because Omologato Watches is run by another mega race fan, big Clark fan. This is the British Green edition, British Racing Green. It's actually their version of the Multichron Galette watch that Jimmy wore in the early 60s, and so that's what this is a rendition of. Obviously it's not the same watch, but I'm very impressed that they've done that.